The chipped ceramic mug warmed my hands, a familiar comfort against the late autumn chill seeping through the window of my small but cozy living room. Outside, the maple leaves, a riot of crimson and gold just a week ago, now danced in swirling gusts before settling onto the damp pavement. It was the kind of day that called for a good book, a soft blanket, and the quiet hum of contentment. For the most part, that's what my life looked like these days. At 58, I'd found a rhythm, a gentle predictability in my work as a librarian at the local branch, and a quiet satisfaction in my independence. But there was one thread in the tapestry of my life that, while seemingly strong, often felt frayed at the edges. My relationship with my mother, Eleanor. Mom was 82 now, and while her mind was still sharp as a tack, her body had started to betray her. Or at least that's what she led me to believe. For the past 5 years, without fail, I'd been sending her $500 every month. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was a significant chunk of my own modest income. She'd always painted a picture of struggling to make ends meet on her fixed income, the rising cost of medication, the unexpected household repairs. And being the dutiful daughter, the one who always felt a pang of guilt at the thought of her mother wanting for anything, I'd never hesitated. Our phone calls were a weekly ritual. Every Sunday evening, right after my favorite PBS show, the phone would ring, and it would be Mom, her voice a familiar blend of complaint and affection. She'd tell me about her aches and pains, the neighbor's noisy dog, the outrageous price of groceries. And invariably, the conversation would circle back to her finances, a subtle reminder of her precarious situation. I'd listen patiently, offering words of comfort and reassurance, never questioning the narrative she presented. After all, she was my mother. Thanksgiving last year had been a perfect example of our dynamic. I'd driven the 3 hours to her small house in Pennsylvania, eager for the familiar comfort of her cooking and the nostalgic warmth of the holiday. Except, as usual, the warmth seemed to radiate mostly from me. I'd brought the turkey, the stuffing ingredients, the pumpkin pie, everything. Really, Mom had greeted me with a hug and a sigh, immediately launching into a monologue about how tight things were this year, how she almost hadn't been able to afford the cranberry sauce. I'd simply smiled and started unpacking the car, the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. The day itself was pleasant enough. We ate, we talked, we watched the Macy's parade. But even amidst the forced cheerfulness, there were little things that pricked at me. Mom had mentioned needing new slippers, but later that afternoon, I'd noticed a brand new, rather expensive-looking bird feeder hanging outside her kitchen window. When I'd commented on it, she'd vaguely said it was a gift from a friend. And then there was Mark. My brother, Mark. Just the mention of his name could still stir up a knot of resentment in my stomach, even after all these years. Mark had always been the golden child, the charmer, the one who could do no wrong in Mom's eyes. Even after he'd essentially swindled a significant amount of money from Dad's small business years ago, leaving it teetering on the brink of collapse and causing Dad so much heartache before he passed, Mom had always found excuses for him. He meant well, she'd say, or he just got mixed up with the wrong crowd. I, on the other hand, who had always been the steady, reliable one, the one who'd stayed close and helped out whenever needed, often felt invisible in her shadow. Mark had drifted in and out of our lives over the years, leaving a trail of broken promises and financial messes in his wake. He hadn't been at Thanksgiving, which, frankly, I was grateful for. But later that evening, as Mom and I were clearing the dishes, I noticed something new on her coffee table. It was a sleek, expensive-looking tablet, still in its box. "Oh, what's this?" I'd asked, picking it up. Mom had waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, that. Mark sent it. Said he got a good deal on it." A good deal? Mark, who I knew was perpetually struggling financially. It didn't quite add up. I'd looked at the price tag on the box. It was easily a few $100s. For a fleeting moment, a tiny seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. It was quickly overshadowed by the familiar wave of guilt for even questioning my mother. Mark, despite everything, was still her son. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally trying to do something nice for her. I'd pushed the thought aside, focusing on the remaining dishes, the warmth of the kitchen, and the familiar rhythm of being the dependable daughter. But looking back now, that tablet, that seemingly innocent gift, was the first subtle tremor before the earthquake. The call came a few weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon, just as I was shelving a cart full of newly returned mysteries. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I saw Mom's name flash across the screen. Usually, she waited until Sunday for our calls. A little knot of worry tightened in my chest. "Sarah, dear?" Her voice sounded thin, almost fragile. "I have some bad news." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Mom? Are you all right?" "Well, the roof. You know that little leak we talked about in the attic?" "Yes. It's gotten much worse. With that last storm, a whole section of shingles came loose. Mr. Henderson from next door took a look, and he said it needs to be fixed right away, or the whole thing could collapse. He quoted me, "Well, it's quite a bit." Her voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken need. "How much, Mom?" I asked, my hand instinctively reaching for the edge of the bookshelf for support. $2,000, she whispered. I don't know how I'm going to manage it, dear. My Social Security barely covers my expenses as it is. $2,000 was a significant sum for me. I had a small emergency fund, but that would almost deplete it entirely. Still, the image of my mother's roof collapsing, the thought of her living in a potentially dangerous house, tugged at my heartstrings. "Okay, Mom," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll figure it out. Let me see what I can do." I spent the rest of the afternoon with a dull ache in my stomach. I called a few contractors in her area, trying to get a sense of whether the quote was reasonable. It seemed to be within the average range. That evening, after a restless night, I transferred $2,000 from my savings account to Mom's. I called her to let her know, and she was effusive with her thanks, her voice sounding much stronger than it had earlier. Relief washed over me, a familiar feeling of having done my duty. Then came the email. It arrived in my inbox on a Friday morning, while I was sorting through the morning delivery of books. The sender was Luxury Cruises and Tours, and the subject line read, "Your upcoming voyage, Eleanor Thompson." My brow furrowed. Eleanor Thompson was my mother's name. I clicked on the email, a strange premonition settling over me. The email detailed a 10-day Caribbean cruise, departing in just a few weeks. It listed the itinerary, the amenities, and the names of the two passengers, Eleanor Thompson and a Mr. Mark Thompson. My breath caught in my throat. Mark? Why would Mom be going on a cruise with Mark? And how could she afford it, especially after her desperate plea for roof repair money? My hands started to tremble as I scrolled through the email. There was a confirmation number, payment details showing a substantial deposit had already been made, and even information about shore excursions. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Could it be a mistake? A wrong email address? But the name was right. And Mark, it had to be my brother. A wave of nausea washed over me. I closed the email, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself there had to be some other explanation. Maybe Mark had won a contest and taken Mom along? But the thought felt flimsy, unconvincing. Over the next few weeks, during our Sunday calls, I tried to subtly bring up the topic of her activities. "So, Mom, anything exciting happening?" I'd ask casually. "Oh, you know, the usual," she'd reply, her voice laced with a familiar weariness. "Just trying to keep up with things around the house. My back has been acting up something awful lately." I press a little further. "Have you been seeing many friends?" "Not really, dear. It's hard to get out much these days." Each answer felt like a carefully constructed lie. The image of that cruise confirmation kept flashing in my mind, a stark contrast to the struggling, housebound woman she portrayed on the phone. My unease grew with each passing day, a heavy weight settling in my gut. I started noticing other things too. She'd mention needing new medications, but then talk about buying a new set of gardening tools. Small inconsistencies, but they started to paint a disturbing picture. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating away at me. I decided to drive down to Pennsylvania for an unexpected visit. I told her I had a free weekend and thought I'd surprise her. She sounded a little flustered on the phone, but agreed to see me. The drive felt longer than usual, my thoughts a jumbled mess of suspicion and hurt. When I arrived at Mom's house, the driveway was empty. A note on the door said, "Gone to the doctor. Back in a few hours." I felt a pang of guilt for doubting her, but the feeling was fleeting. I let myself in with the spare key she'd given me years ago. The house was quiet, filled with the familiar scent of dust and lavender. I wandered into the living room, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. Everything seemed normal. But then, something caught my eye on the corner of her desk. It was a manila folder slightly ajar. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, compelled me to open it. Inside, the first thing I saw was a bank statement. My eyes scanned the transactions and my blood ran cold. There were the regular $500 deposits I made every month, clearly labeled. But then, I saw a series of large cash withdrawals, several times a month, in amounts ranging from $200 to $500. There were also online transfers, frequent and substantial, to an account number I didn't recognize. My hands shook as I dug deeper into the folder. I found receipts from expensive restaurants, for jewelry, for electronics. And then, tucked away at the back, I found them. Bank transfer confirmations, each one detailing a transfer to Mark Thompson. The amounts varied, but they were all significant, often exceeding the $500 I sent her. My mind reeled. She wasn't just using my money to supplement her income. She was actively funding Mark's life, secretly, behind my back. The weight of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The roof repair, the struggling finances, the Caribbean cruise with Mark. It all clicked into place, a devastating mosaic of lies and manipulation. Years of feeling like the overlooked child, the one who always came second, crystallized in that moment. The quiet hum of contentment I'd found in my life shattered, replaced by a cold, hard knot of anger and hurt. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the blatant deception, the years of being played, and the realization that the dependable daughter had been nothing more than a convenient ATM. I was still clutching the bank statements when I heard the key turn in the front door. My heart hammered against my ribs as Eleanor walked in, a small bag from the pharmacy in her hand. Her smile faltered when she saw me standing in the living room, my face pale, the folder open on the coffee table. "Sarah, you're here already. I thought you were coming later." Her eyes darted nervously to the folder in my hand. I didn't say anything, just held up the bank statement, my finger pointing to a recent transfer to Mark. Her face drained of color. What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't insult my intelligence, Mom," I said, my voice low and steady, but trembling with barely contained anger. "This is your bank statement. And these," I gestured to the other documents scattered on the table, "are receipts for things you told me you couldn't afford. And these," I held up the transfer confirmations, my hand shaking slightly, "these are regular payments to Mark. Thousands of dollars, Mom. Where did this money come from?" Eleanor's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and she sank onto the edge of the sofa, her gaze fixed on the carpet. It's not what you think, dear." "Then tell me what it is, Mom," I challenged, my voice rising slightly. "Tell me how you could look me in the eye every month. Tell me you were struggling, while secretly funneling my money to Mark. The same Mark who practically ruined Dad. The same Mark who hasn't spoken to me in years." Tears welled up in her eyes. "He's your brother, Sarah. He's going through a rough patch. He needed my help." "And what about me, Mom?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Didn't I need help? Didn't I work hard for this money? Didn't you tell me you were proud of my responsibility, my willingness to help you?" "I am proud of you, dear," she said, her voice choked with sobs. "But Mark, he has no one else." "And I do," I retorted, the years of feeling second best boiling over. "You always say that, Mom. Mark has no one else. But what about me? Have you ever stopped to think about how this makes me feel? Knowing that you trust him, the one who hurt this family so deeply, more than you trust me, the one who has always been here for you. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. It's different, Sarah. You're strong. You're independent. Mark, he's always been more fragile. Fragile? I scoffed. He's a grown man, Mom. He's made his own choices. And you've always been there to bail him out no matter what he does. While I've been scrimping and saving, sending you money I thought you desperately needed, you've been using it to enable his irresponsibility. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by Eleanor's quiet sobs. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions: anger, hurt, and a deep sense of betrayal. The woman sitting in front of me, the woman I had always believed was honest with me, had been living a lie for years. The roof, I said, my voice trembling slightly. You needed $2,000 for the roof. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Yes, it's still leaking. And the cruise? I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. The 10-day Caribbean cruise you're taking with Mark in a few weeks? How does that fit into your struggling budget, Mom? Eleanor's eyes widened in alarm. How did you? I got an email, I said flatly. So, while I'm worrying about your leaky roof, you're planning a vacation with the son who hasn't bothered to call me in years. Paid for, no doubt, with the money I sent you for your expenses. The truth hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw not just my aging parent, but a woman who had consistently prioritized one child over the other, a woman who had manipulated my generosity for her own purposes. A sudden wave of clarity washed over me. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't continue to be taken advantage of, to be lied to and used. The years of resentment, the feeling of always coming second, finally coalesced into a firm resolve. Mom, I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the turmoil inside me. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep sending you money when it's clearly not being used for what you say it is. As of today, I'm stopping all financial support. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. What? Sarah, you can't do that. How will I manage? You've been managing all this time, Mom, I said, gesturing to the bank statements. You've just been managing with my money, and apparently Mark's too. Maybe it's time you both figured out how to manage on your own. But the roof, and my medication, she pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. There are programs to help seniors with those expenses, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You need to look into them. I've been enabling this for too long, and I'm done. I stood up, my legs feeling shaky but my resolve firm. I gathered the bank statements and receipts, placing them back in the folder. I'm going now, Mom. She reached out a hand, her eyes filled with tears. Please, Sarah, don't do this. We can talk about it. We are talking about it, Mom, I said, looking down at her. And I've made my decision. I turned and walked towards the door, the weight on my shoulders feeling lighter than it had in years. As I reached the threshold, I paused. And Mom, I added, turning back to face her, maybe you should consider who really needs your help right now, because it's not Mark. It's you who needs to learn to be honest and fair. Then, I walked out, leaving her sitting alone on the sofa, the silence of the house amplifying the finality of my decision. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control, a sense of freedom. The dependable daughter had finally decided to depend on herself. The silence in my car was deafening as I drove away from Mom's house. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. A whirlwind of emotions churned inside me: anger, relief, guilt, and a strange sense of liberation. Had I done the right thing? Had I been too harsh? The familiar tug of obligation warred with the newfound sense of self-preservation. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. It was Eleanor. I stared at the screen for a long moment before declining the call. Then it buzzed again, and again. By the time I reached the highway, I had received 7 missed calls and 3 voicemails, all from her. I knew what they would say: accusations, guilt trips, desperate pleas. I couldn't face them yet. I turned my phone off and focused on the road ahead, the familiar landscape blurring through my tear-filled eyes. When I finally turned my phone back on later that evening, there were more messages from Mom, and a few angry texts from a number I didn't recognize. It didn't take long to figure out it was Mark. His messages were short, accusatory, and entitled, demanding to know why I had cut off Mom and insisting that I had no right to interfere in their lives. I simply blocked the number. The first few weeks were a roller coaster. Mom continued to call, sometimes from different numbers. Her voicemails ranged from tearful apologies and promises to change, to angry accusations of being a heartless daughter. I found myself constantly checking my phone, bracing myself for the next emotional onslaught. Sleep became a luxury, my nights filled with replays of our confrontation and nagging doubts about my decision. The guilt was the hardest part. For years, I had been conditioned to prioritize Mom's needs, to feel responsible for her well-being. The thought of her struggling, even though I knew her struggles had been exaggerated, gnawed at me. I found myself second-guessing my resolve, wondering if I had overreacted. Maybe Mark really did need her help. Maybe I should have found a way to help Mom without enabling Mark. I confided in my friend, Carol, during our weekly coffee date. Carol had always been a voice of reason in my life, and I knew she would offer an honest perspective. I recounted the events of my visit, the discovery of the secret transfers, and my decision to cut off financial support. Carol listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Sarah," she said gently, "you did the right thing. You were being used, and it's not your responsibility to fund Mark's lifestyle. Your mother made her choices, and now she has to live with the consequences." Her words were like a balm to my wounded spirit. Carol reminded me of all the times I had put Mom's needs before my own, the sacrifices I had made over the years. She pointed out that I deserved to have financial security and peace of mind, and that Mom's manipulation had been unfair and damaging. As the days turned into weeks, the initial shock and guilt began to subside, replaced by a growing sense of empowerment. I started to see things more clearly. Mom's favoritism towards Mark wasn't new. It had been a pattern throughout our lives. I remembered countless instances of her bending over backwards for him, while my own accomplishments and needs were often overlooked. I had always accepted it, chalking it up to his being more fragile. But now I realized it was a form of manipulation, a way for her to maintain control and ensure I continued to be the reliable one, the one who would always pick up the slack. I started to reflect on my own life, the things I had put on hold because I felt obligated to send Mom money. A small trip I had always wanted to take, a pottery class I had considered enrolling in. These small dreams had been pushed aside, year after year, because of my perceived financial obligations. Now, with that burden lifted, a sense of possibility began to bloom within me. I started taking long walks in the park, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the beauty of the changing leaves. I reconnected with old friends, had dinner parties, and even started looking into local art classes. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself, not just fulfilling an obligation. Mom continued to try to reach me, her tactics shifting from anger to tearful pleas and even feigned illness. But each time, I reminded myself of the bank statements, the cruise confirmation, the years of subtle and not-so-subtle manipulation. I started responding to her messages, but my tone was firm and unwavering. I made it clear that while I still cared about her well-being, I would no longer be enabling her financial support of Mark. The silence from Mark was deafening. I knew he was likely furious, his gravy train having come to an abrupt halt. But his silence only solidified my decision. If he truly cared about Mom, he would have reached out to me, perhaps even apologized for his past behavior. But his entitlement and anger spoke volumes. Through the initial turmoil, I had started to realize a fundamental truth. I couldn't control my mother's choices, and I couldn't force her to treat me fairly. All I could control was my own response. And my response was to finally prioritize myself, to set boundaries, and to step away from a dynamic that had been draining me for far too long. The dependable daughter was finally learning to depend on her own strength. Months drifted by, and the sharp edges of the initial fallout began to soften. The constant calls from Mom dwindled to occasional emails, their tone shifting from demanding to almost plaintive. She still made no mention of the cruise with Mark, and I didn't bring it up. I responded to her email sporadically, keeping my replies brief and focused on neutral topics like the weather or her health, though I took her complaints with a significant grain of salt. Mark remained conspicuously absent, a silence that spoke volumes about his true motivations. Life settled into a new rhythm for me. My finances were certainly healthier, but more importantly, my mental and emotional well-being had improved dramatically. The constant worry and resentment had lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and control I hadn't realized I was missing. I finally enrolled in that pottery class I'd been putting off for years, and the feel of the cool clay between my fingers was surprisingly therapeutic. I even booked a short solo trip to the coast, something I'd always dreamed of doing but never felt I could justify financially. Standing on the windswept beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt a profound sense of peace and freedom. Eleanor sent a card for my birthday, a generic store-bought one with a brief, impersonal message. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the rift between us. It felt like a final confirmation of the kind of relationship we truly had. It was a little sad, but surprisingly, it didn't sting as much as I thought it would. I realized that I had mourned the mother I wished I had, and now I was finally accepting the mother she was. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She mentioned that she had run into Eleanor at the grocery store, and that Mom had been complaining about being abandoned by her ungrateful daughter. My cousin, bless her heart, had seen through it immediately, knowing my history of supporting Mom. Her email was filled with words of encouragement and validation, reminding me that I wasn't alone in dealing with complicated family dynamics. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to me.